So here's my question for you. I got one question for you. What's the first rule of Fight Club? What's the second rule of Fight Club?
The first rule of Fight Club is you do not talk about Fight Club. The second rule of Fight Club is you do not talk about Fight Club.
So now we know we're not supposed to talk about Fight Club. Well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to explore some stuff in James this morning, and he says, let's talk about Fight Club. Let's talk about Fight Club. And what he does is he's talking about the root of one of the issues in our life, which is conflict with other people. Now, that might be with your spouse. It may be with your boss. It may be with your family, your friends, people you go to school with, your next door neighbor. But he says, look, there's this issue with fighting and quarreling and battles that happens between human beings very naturally and universally and throughout time. And what he wants to do is he wants to say, look and pay attention to this. We want to talk about Fight Club because we want to recognize, what does it mean that I have these quarrels with other people? What does it boil down to in our life? And so in James chapter 4, verse 1, James says these words. He asks the question, what causes fights and quarrels among you, in between you, at each other? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? That there's a battle going on inside, and it is shown in a battle that comes out in between human beings. All right? He says, what causes this? Where does this come from? You want something, but you don't get it. You kill and you covet, but you can't have what you want. You quarrel and fight, and you don't have because you don't ask God. And when you do ask, you don't receive because you ask with the wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your own pleasure, on your own joy, on your own goals, on what makes you most happy. Now, it's trippy because if you've been reading this book or this letter, whatever this is, he's been saying over and over, he has this really gentle demeanor with them. He's called them friends or dear friends like 8 times. My friends. He knows they're having difficulty. They're under pressure in the world they live in. Are you under pressure? This applies to you. You quarrel and fight with anybody? Don't look at that person that's in the room. Do you quarrel and fight? Do you find yourself combatant a lot with people or ideas in the world that make you angry and create quarrels? He says, look, you need to look inside. And he goes, he's been talking really nice to him, but now he really kind of just says, look, you need to see something about yourself. And earlier he said, when you hear the word of God, hold up the mirror. Don't hold up the mirror to somebody else. Say, hey, Sheldon, look at yourself. Hey, Andrew, check yourself out. He says, turn it around, look at yourself in the mirror, and try to see what's going on. He goes, because it's universal. If you look at what's going on in our country right now, there's all these battles and, people just angry with each other, and there's racial conflict and economic conflict, and there's conflict with police and civilians. Our world is conflict with each other. Every one of us have people that we're in conflict with at times. Sometimes in our marriage, again, in our workplace, in our families, our friendships, our neighborhoods. And what he's saying is, I want you to pay attention, Chuck. Now, this message is for me too, right? So I got to turn the mirror around and look at myself. So if you hear me saying you, I'm not pointing at you like I'm not seeing myself in the mirror, and I have been all week. What causes my quarrels and my fights? He says, look, you have this battle that goes on within you in verse 1. He says, inside of you, there's a wrestling match. Your nature as human beings, even if you're the sweetest person in the world, even if you're Andrea Gerwig, my wife, who is the sweetest person I know, still possess this nature, this tendency to be selfish and deviant and destructive, even if you're at a very, very high level of kindness. That there's this battle that goes on within us by our very nature. It's like it's how we're wired. It's kind of the bad news. And he says this spills out in quarrels and fights among you. And the words he uses here are like the words that people use about going to battle, where people are going to fight. If you think UFC or gladiators or something like this. It's the idea of a war. He says you want something that you want and you don't have it. And as a result, you end up fighting with each other to try to get whatever it is. That could be for them to see things your way. That could be for them to say, I'm sorry to you. That could be for you to get something other than what you currently have. He says, this is what happens. It's inside of us. It's our nature. This battle that goes on inside that shoots outside. He uses big words like you kill and you covet. I don't think they were like carjacking people at gunpoint, shooting up at the curb and taking their, donkey, right? I don't think they were donkey jacking anybody. Oh, sweet, that'd be a great name for a band, Donkey Jack. Okay, so I don't think that's what was happening. I don't think they were like killing each other. He's using huge words here, like Jesus did. And he says, like, when you speak evilly towards your brother, because you've committed murder. That's what he's talking about here. He says, then you covet. You want what you don't have. You're not happy. Are we ever satisfied? No. He says, so as a result, you kind of want more. Wherever you're at, you want more or you want different. He goes, and it's this battle that goes on within you, and it's kind of the way the world functions. And he says, you quarrel and fight. And he goes, and you don't really go, God, what do you want from me? Here's what I want. Would you bring that to me? He says, you generally don't do that. Instead, you kind of fight to try to get your way and your pleasure and what it is you want. And he says, and when you do ask God for things, he goes, honestly, it's mostly that you want to spend it on your own pleasure and self-worth. He's talking to these people that he loves. He's saying, man, check yourself out. Because the world that we live in is like this. This is kind of the world vibe. And he goes, don't vibe with the world. Don't vibe with that because it creates what we have in our world today and what they had in their world then. He's really pointing out this idea of worldliness as being discontent and combativeness with other human beings. Now, when I first became a Christian, the way I remember people talking about worldliness always had to do with external things, right? Had to do like what you wear, what kind of music you listen to. Some of you had that same experience maybe. Worldly people, they listen to certain kind of music, they dress a certain way, they do certain things, has to do with behaviors. But in this passage, and also if you're a Bible student, write down 1 Corinthians 3:3. It points to the idea that fights and quarreling and selfishness, self at the center, those are the things that have to do with worldliness in a great matter of the things of the world. That worldliness is connected to the idea of our selfish desire that we run over others to get what we want for ourselves. 1 Corinthians 3:3 says, are you not still worldly? He goes, man, when you're battling against each other, it's just showing you your worldliness. It's an indicator. It's like a thermometer. It's like when you get a Thanksgiving turkey and it has a little red pop-up thing and it pops up and it tells you turkey's done. I mean, that's what fighting should be alerting us to is, wow, there's something going on. And in both these passages, he connects this idea of worldliness, the desire for self, putting self at the center, to be the core of what it means to be caught up in this world system. Because it's not just that we individually have this problem with our flesh and our internals. It has to do with the way that we collectively interact. If you're here last week, we talked about the idea that selfish ambition, that really is an unwise way to live, and it is the nature of this world. The gravity of this world pulls us to say, you have to be number one, you have to look out for number one. If there's a point in your life where you're looking out for somebody else, it's generally smaller because the world says, if you don't take care of yourself, no one else will. It's the gravity of that world. It says, you have to be at the center. So illustration, if you look at it, it says here, that in the world's view, self is at the center and others in God are kind of out here. So the world's viewpoint on life is this, is that we need to make sure that we take care of ourselves, put ourselves at the center, and then try to radiate out good things towards God and other people. And that's what James is saying here, and Paul agrees with him in 1 Corinthians 3. Is he's saying the problem is you want to put yourself at the center. You have something, but whatever you have, you really want something more. You're looking out there and saying, I really covet this other person, place, thing, a noun, I'm looking out and this, what I have is not good enough. My house isn't good enough. My car, my guitars, my motorcycles, my surfboard, my job, my wife, my husband, my children. We're always looking out there. It's our nature, is to look out for ourselves and then to try to find anything we can to just be happy, our own pleasure. And this is the way the world system works. And God's system works really, really differently. He says, you really got to spin the globe on its axis, because God says, put self outside the circle. In fact, put God in the very center. And then the next level out is others. And then finally, you find yourself in the outer layer. And God says, this is the correct way to live. So there's the world way, self at the center, and there is God's way, or the heavenly way. And he says that's where Christ himself is at the center and the core. And then others come next. And then finally we find ourselves out in this other ring. And he's talking to him and he's saying, guys, check yourself. Don't get caught up in the way the world thinks. It's just not all about you, Chuck. It's not all about, are you happy? It's not all about, do you get pleasure out of everything? Is everything just the most desirous for you? It's not about reaching out for more and making number one. He says that's the system of the world that is antithetical to the kingdom of God. And he proves it because God himself says, I will put myself aside. I'll come to earth. Instead of himself being at the center of his own pleasure, his own goodness, his own fame, what he does is he puts himself outside. Jesus puts himself outside in a sense. He puts God the Father in the center. He puts others here around them, and then he ministers to God through ministering to others, but he keeps himself in the outside rings. And he examples it, and he says, this is what will make the world an amazing place. He ran to a totally, totally different gravity. But the problem that these guys, and maybe we face, is that our tendency is to kind of get in the rhythm of the world or be pulled in by the gravity of the world that says, I need to make my ideas first, my pleasure and my happiness first. I need to reach for more because whatever I have quite isn't enough. We get pulled into that. So James, after calling them friends, dear friends, 8 times, he gets almost like Old Testament prophet on them. You find that here in verse 4. He goes, you adulterous people. Whoa, what a change, right? So there's this loving pastor who loves them, but now he says, look, let me talk to you really clearly, really straight. He goes, you adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world is hatred towards God? Anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. And for many people, they read this, and they think, well, here's the deal. We've got to pull away from, it's like good guys, bad guys, right? White hats, black hats. So we go, oh, what he's saying here is we don't want to be worldly, so we've got to pull away from the bad people who do bad things. And we've got to stay away from them, and we've got to stay away from their culture and all that. But the context of all of this, worldliness, has to do with this. What? Selfish ambition, vain conceit, our desires and our lust for what it is that we want, to live with self at center. That's the context here, not externals. And it's not the other guy. So for so many years, it seems like people have beat up people who are outside the household of faith and talk to them about being, outsiders. And they're the bad people, and we're the good people. They should come in here with us, and then we pull away. I mean, that's the whole basis of sectarianism, right? Like the Amish folks, who I think probably genuinely love God, but they misread the idea of worldliness, and they pull away. Many people in monasteries, they pull away from the bad people, the worldliness in the world, where there's alcohol and there's drugs and there's sexual promiscuity, and they pull away. And that's not what this passage is talking about. It's saying, look inside yourself for your own selfishness, because you can be just as selfish in a monastery as you can be out here. Amen? You can be totally self-focused. You can be all about trying to just avoid all the wrong things to the total detriment of the gospel. What he's saying here is he's like, look, you got to be really careful that what you're married to is the God who loves you. He's speaking here to Christians, not to non-Christians. He's not knocking the people of the world. He's not getting into any of that. What he's saying is, you, my Christian brothers and sisters, he goes, your fidelity isn't to God. It's like you're kind of cheating on God with this other system of thought, which he's denoted as being not just the system of the world and the brokenness inside of us. But he's saying it actually has a kind of a demonic kind of spin to it. You know, your enemy wants to take you and say, just be fully worried about everything here. Be all focused on this here, everything that goes on around this globe. Get all combative with other people of other nations. Let's go to war. Let's fight with one another in our own town. Right here, let's just fight. Let's not get along. Let's go after what we want. Let's covet what we don't have. It's like there's this whole thing here. And so there's these two ways of being connected spiritually, according to James. One is connected to the heavenly wisdom, the heavenly God, the one who loves us, and who examples loving self last and putting God first. Or the other is to be part of this world system and to love this. And he says, look, if you, and when he says, you know, to be friends with the world, people are saying, see, you shouldn't have friends that aren't Christians. That's not what this is talking about. It's talking about with this world system of self at the center. It says, if you espouse that and you follow that, he goes, really what you're doing is you are married to that. Who do you really love? You really love the world. And if you really love the world, who do you really love? He's just being totally honest with him. He goes, yourself. It's our greatest problem. We want to push God off the throne and we want to be God. From the very beginning, in the garden, wherever the garden was, somewhere over here, wherever the garden was, at some point in time, there was a situation that happened where Adam chose himself and his own pleasure and his own desire. And he put himself upon the throne. He pushed God off and he said, I want to be at the center. I want knowledge. I want power. I want pleasure. It looks good to eat and I'm hungry. I'm a dude. I'm hungry all the time, right? And that same thing has resonated all the way through time. And so God says through James here, he says, look, don't you recognize that if your love and your fidelity is to this world system with yourself at the center, that it's really, and he's using these huge contrasts, it's like hatred of God. It's infidelity to God, who came and lived out a life of selflessness and put others before himself. And what he's saying is you guys are caught up, you're scattered around the world in a difficult situation, and you're tempted to just buy in. And he goes, don't do it. Be faithful to your God and walk with him. Love God. Put him at the center, not yourself. Because self-centered living really is what it is it's like that pop-up timer on the turkey. When it pops up and it says, I'm done. I'm overdone. And that's where we are with God because of our natural tendency. Right? Is to seek ourselves, to seek our own pleasure, our own protection. If you're fighting with your spouse, oftentimes it's because you want your point of view. You selfishly want yourself to be at the center. You selfishly want to protect yourself. Jesus says, man, love your enemies. There's a whole different gravity. And he says, when you recognize fighting and quarreling, selfishness, and desire for your own way, your own goals, your own pleasures, as Christian, he says, recognize you may be falling into the gravitational field of this world. And that when you do, you're going to find yourself not married to Christ, not married to the way that he lived his life. You're going to find yourself cheating on God with the world and making yourself at the center of things. And it's like the natural condition. It's like the natural condition of our earth is gravity holds us to the ground. Unless something changes really radically, and then that could be very interesting, you know. But there is gravity and it holds us to the ground. And there's this moral gravity. And it has to do with ourself. And this is what I love about James is, you find this loving, tender pastor. He wants to give them everything he can, but he also is just willing to tell them the truth. And he says, don't you recognize that if you love this and everything that's in it and you just want more, don't you recognize that you're really married to that? Don't you recognize that's where your true alliance and your true love is? And in the end, it just, like he said in chapter 3, he goes, it just becomes a downward spiral. And that's what we see is people who follow that path, me first, in my relationships, at work, whatever else, in my family, when I make my happiness, me being right first. I mean, even if you're married and you're involved sexually and intimately, if you make it all about yourself and your pleasure, guess what kind of intimate life you're going to have? Not the best one. Jeremy was like, big, guess what? In every area of our lives, spiritually, socially, physically, emotionally, God says, Make me at the center. Let it radiate out through others. Serve others before yourself. And when you do, you're part of the gravitational pull of the kingdom of heaven. It changes the world. Jesus changed the world by that very principle. And so he says, man, Chuck, watch yourself. Do you ever feel like if you're, Jeremy, I'm sorry to use you as an example, but I mean, think about Jeremy, who's given everything he has to come here to serve at a church plant, sketchy Santa Cruz, not the place to plant a church if you want 1 billion people to come. It's hard. It's really expensive here, somebody told me, It's really expensive here. All kinds of allergens, all kinds of bad stuff, right? Social allergens too. All kinds of funky stuff. You come here, you serve God, you go through all this, you put yourself last, and you could get really tired. And I'm not saying you are or that you have, but it's easy to get tired going, man, I'm tired of putting other people first because the world system looks a lot better. And so he says, watch yourself, caution, careful. Now what I love about James is he also doesn't say, and because you're spiritual adulterers, you must go to the pit of the unfaithful woman and be piled upon by live rabbit squirrels for eternity. That's not what he does. He doesn't say, so heck with you guys. You're not performing well as Christians. Aren't you glad he says that? Because we don't perform so well as Christians either, most of us, not over a lifetime. He doesn't say that. Here's what he says. Remember, these are Jewish Christians spread out around the world. He goes, pull in towards God. Come in close towards God. He says, just see yourself. Chuck, when you see yourself fighting with Andrew because you just want it your way or you just want to prove your point or you want to just defend yourself, or you're fighting over some political issue on one side of the line or the other, whatever, and you just find this combative-ish attitude. He goes, don't you recognize that's not the gravity of my kingdom? He says, so come in close. Now, if you're a Jewish Christian, the idea of coming close to God is a new idea, right? I mean, they had walls of separation. They had like a holy place separated by another holy place, by another holy place, by walls, by guards, people with sharp sticks, and there was all these rules and how you could approach and all that. So here he's saying, look, don't you recognize? He says, you're an adulterer, but that an adulterer is connected to the idea that they have someone who loved them and said, I do to them one day. And he says, you have this God who's calling you back. He's not saying, you horrible person, you're just like the world, so go to hell, literally. What he's saying here is he's saying, move towards your spouse, the one who loves you. God is the God of the millionth chance, which is the only reason that I'm here with you. But he talks about this kind of reconciliation with God and with the gravity of heaven. In verse 7, he says, submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil, and he'll flee from you. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. This was, wow, that's right. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail. Change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. And he comes back around. I love it that he connects to this idea of humility like he did in the last chapter we looked at last week. He connects it to the idea of humility that says, I need to recognize that I am not the center of the globe. Everything is not about me. I need to see myself as simply a child of God who is beloved, but other people, I need to see them as more valuable, to use the words of the New Testament. So submit yourself to God then. Turn yourself over to God and say, God, I recognize you as God. You're the King. You're the King of heaven. You're also the one who's chosen to connect himself and marry yourself to me. Indivisible. And so, God, I come before you and I submit myself to you instead of the system of the planet I live to. I recognize in myself the desire for selfish wants, desires. I want to be number one. I want to be on the throne. I recognize that. And so I submit myself to you, God, as my king. And he goes on and talks about the negative kind of spiritual aspect and says, resist the evil one and he will flee from you. That there's a point where I have to go, wow, I recognize that my fight with my boss or my ugly spam that I sent somebody, I have to recognize that there's a spiritual angle on that too. I need to resist the evil one who's trying to use my own conflict to break up and mess up others. And he says, come near to God. Come near to God. God doesn't say, that's it, I'm divorcing you over this. What he says is come near to me. Have you ever read in the Old Testament where God portrays Israel as kind of a prostitute who's always running away from, he's married to a prostitute. But he loves her and he calls her back. I mean, if you were in that situation, how many more times, in the words of Led Zeppelin, sorry about it, I mean, that's what that song's about. Really, how many times is somebody going to run away from you and go off with some other man or woman or whatever it is, and that you're going to take them back and you're going to love them the same? And then they're going to run off and you're going to go, it's okay, I love you the same. Hurts me, but I love you the same. And what he says is, come on close to God, because he wants to draw near to you. Even though you're imperfect, you get caught in the gravity of this world. And continuing this kind of prophetic theme, he's like, wash your hands and cleanse your hearts. The deeds that come from your hands, the things that happen inside of our mind and our inner person. He's talking about ritual washing, the way people would come and cleanse themselves before they approach God. He says, man, don't be all stoked about everything. He goes, just for a minute, you need to recognize if you're caught in this meanness, this self-centeredness, desire for your own pleasure over that of all others. He says, if you find yourself there, mourn it. Recognize there's a God who loves you and that you've pushed him away to go off with someone else. Mourn it. Wash your hands, cleanse yourself of it. And then he finally says again, humble yourself before God. He didn't tell you to tell somebody else to be humble or beat them up or say mean things to them. It's totally between you and God. And he says, find yourself at a place, Chuck, where you choose yourself to see yourself for who you are. I'm a broken human being. I'm created in the image of God, but I'm fouled up. My tendency is to always choose self. If I just let myself go, I fall into that. And he says, recognize when you do that you're buying into a system. You're buying into a system that's antithetical to God's. He says, humble yourself in that. So Fight Club says, first rule of Fight Club, and the second rule is this: don't talk about it. James says, I want to talk about it. That our wars, our battles, our fighting, all of our disagreements are connected somewhere. They tingle this thing inside of ourselves that says, me first. I got to protect me. I got to love me. That we have a tendency in ourselves to just seek what gives us the most joy and the most pleasure as opposed to what blesses others, even though we've been shown different in Jesus. And that in God's economy, there's this different kind of set of circles. And it says, if God remains at the core of who you are, and you love God first, and you say, Jesus, I want my life to be about you. I'll take one in the stomach for you. I'll take one in the face for you. I'll be willing to be wronged by others. People could even take an advantage of me, and I'll do my best not to, but I will, in love, I will put you at the core, and then I'm going to put other people next out. I'm not going to seek my own self, my own goodness, my own fame. I'm not going to seek to be right all the time and defend myself and protect myself from everybody, because you didn't. I'm going to live a life for others in the imitation of you. And I come at the third ring in the diagram. That I live here, God, to serve you, and I serve you through others, as opposed to living purely for myself. And the thing is it's that kind of love, it's that kind of mindset that brought Jesus here. It's that kind of mindset that changed the trajectory of this planet from a fiery ending, a final ending, to a heavenly one, to a place where love abounds, where that kind of genetic chain is broken of me first, me first, me first, me best. I want for me this. And so he calls them to this hard thing. He says, look in the mirror, Chuck. You can put your own name. Look in the mirror. Think of the person that you have the most conflict with. The person that you are most angry with for all that they've done to you. And recognize that God tells you to move off of the throne, to place him at the center, his way of doing things, and to love outwardly into that. To put your place outside of that. And what that does is it brings just a taste and a smell of the kingdom to the world around you. It kind of reverses the gravity a little bit. So he calls us to look at ourselves, not anybody else, just us. And can we be people who bring into this world outsideness, love that goes outward instead of needs that come inward that are never totally met. And in that, the truth of the matter is the greatest joy and fulfillment you ever feel is when you get yourself off of the throne and you serve others and you leave Jesus in his rightful place. So I'm working on that. I hope you are too. What's God saying to you? Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Let's pray. Father, thank you that you're so calm and gentle with us. You are so patient with us. God, we recognize that inside ourselves is self. And we push ourselves to the center in some ways, and sometimes in many ways, and sometimes in every way. So God, I pray that you would, through the power of your Spirit, I pray that you would speak to me and those that you brought into this room for us to recognize the indicator that it means when we find fights and quarrels in ourselves, that it shows us our own selfishness, our own lack of fidelity and faithfulness to you, given what you've done for us. And pray that you'd make us peacemakers and help us to learn to live in a way that puts you on the throne. And Lord, keep me from creeping back up so that this world would be a better and more beautiful place. And lastly, God, thank you that there's a better world that is centered around you, that recognizes you as the true God, that in the rebuilding of all that, that it's a place of peace finally. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.